the decision of what they wish to accomplish with these tools. Similarly, while players of any particular character level in WoW will typically only be seen with others of the same level bracket, it's commonplace for a fleet in EVE to be comprised of players with widely different character skills accumulated. Still, there was a significant fear that the harsh and hostile nature of EVE would push players into the much more inviting World of Warcraft. The dedicated EVE player base took to referring to WoW pejoratively. An oft-repeated insult was that an EVE player leaving for World of Warcraft increases the average IQ score of both games. But soon, Crowd Control Productions would begin competing with Blizzard in an entirely different way. In 2006, CCP announced a new collectible card game named EVE: The Second Genesis, identical to its namesake game on launch. During this time period, many creative companies were looking to emulate the success of such properties as Magic the Gathering, Pokemon, and Yu-Gi-Oh!, and the developers of EVE Online were no exception. Hoping to build excitement, Crowd Control Productions organized a 128-player pre-release tournament at Gen Con, a large gaming convention. At the same convention, Blizzard was giving a similar sneak preview of their own upcoming collectible card game, simply called the World of Warcraft Trading Card Game. Then, on November 11, 2006, less than a month after the launch of the card game, Crowd Control Productions announced that they were acquiring White Wolf Publishing, a prolific and well-established publisher of tabletop RPG games, including the popular Vampire the Masquerade. In 2005, CCP had quietly approached White Wolf, looking for assistance creating their collectible card game based on EVE Online. Later, in an interview with Shack News, White Wolf marketing director Kelly Barnes-Herman stated that, quote, "Because of our history in managing the award-winning Vampire the Eternal Struggle collectible card game, White Wolf was able to make suggestions and provide some initial guidance to CCP in the first stages of the game launch, and now we are looking forward to working on the first expansion set in 2007. End quote. CCP had gone from making their own board game to buying another company to make tabletop games for them. What's more, CCP also announced that it would be publishing new games based on intellectual properties owned by White Wolf, including the World of Darkness setting, home to Vampire the Masquerade. The immediate hope was for a sequel to the beloved cult classic Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines video game, a significant and undoubtedly costly undertaking. But a new Bloodlines game would not be as ambitious as another project that they were about to announce. In 2007, CCP announced a new massively multiplayer online game based on the White Wolf IP, simply titled World of Darkness. However, details at the time were scant. In an interview with Eurogamer, CCP's marketing director Magnus Bergson said that, quote, "We're not really hiding any information about it, we just don't know the release date yet. The actual design and exactly how it's going to be is being created right now, so when we actually know all of that, we can guesstimate how long it's going to take. These games typically take 4 or 5 years to make. I don't think this is going to be any different." End quote. Now, as CCP were attempting to balance and progress EVE Online, they were also responsible for the development of an entirely new MMO. However, this wasn't the only new major project that CCP would announce. At their annual EVE FanFest celebration in November of 2007, the company showed a trailer for a massive update to the game that they called Ambulation. This future update promised players the ability to exit their ships in stations and meet one another in-game face-to-face, something that could potentially make the game far more immersive. Despite the incredible amount of work that the company had promised to deliver, they were confident that they could fund numerous projects in part thanks to their growing and dedicated subscribership, driven by the chaos churning inside of New Eden. As the wars in Nullsec raged and EVE's player base grew, reporters within the gaming industry were beginning to take notice. Consistently, stories of battles with dozens, if not hundreds of players were beginning to leak out into gaming forums and early social media websites. Those hearing about such battles might have acknowledged mentions of the struggles with lag and server instability with which fleet commanders constantly had to contend, but such complaints were quickly forgotten when the scale of certain battles was shared. Fleet commanders had learned not to take such large fights unless absolutely necessary due to the chaos introduced by such numbers, but their rarity only made them more tantalizing. What's more, these battles were given context due to the persistent state of the game, with corporations and alliances vying for power, territory,
Your skill has
and
increased.
wealth in a constantly evolving drama. To many, it felt like a space opera playing out in real time. In early 2008, one of the first articles detailing the ongoing Nullsec war was published for PC Gamer UK. The author, Jim Rossignol, opened by writing, quote, "There's a war going on. It's one of the most bitterly contested conflicts imaginable, fought over many months by an international cast of veteran warriors. An entire galaxy is at stake. You probably even know someone who is caught up in it, fighting for his life and those of his comrades. As many as 20,000 people have fought in its battles. This war is the Great War of EVE Online, the largest virtual conflict ever waged. Unlike the 20-minute conflicts that characterize other multiplayer games, this is a deathmatch that has taken place between fleets of hundreds in a continuous process that has lasted years. It is the greatest imaginary conflict yet conducted, and in what follows, I'll be tracing its glories and mapping its horrors." End quote. This sort of romantic prose would quickly come to characterize most of the writing about New Eden, and while they occasionally would acknowledge the more technical and practical issues that players and their leaders faced, these passages were nearly always diminished in favor of telling stories of epic campaigns and pitched battles. The results and aims of these large battles, however, were difficult to communicate due to the inherently intricate nature of the game's mechanics. What could easily be communicated, however, was sovereignty. Territorial maps reminiscent of war documentaries gave the impression that the warriors involved in these conflicts were actively making history, and granted the movements of these wars similar weight. But perhaps more immediately attractive was the attempt to give a price to ships in real-world fiat currency. Partway through his article, Rossignol writes a relatively short passage about the loss of Steve the Titan. Quote, "It's not hard to see why Band of Brothers would want to attack the biggest alliance in the game. The riches were there for the taking, and the alliance leader, one Sivok, piloted the first and then only Titan-class ship in the game. It was a giant behemoth that has been valued in real-world cash at around 4,000 British pounds. Band of Brothers seized the first Titan kill in controversial circumstances and sealed the fate of a single frontier." End quote. This passing attempt at an approximation of price would become a tradition in coverage of the game. The daunting complexity of EVE's mechanics and the tangle of relationships between corporations, alliances, and even corporations within alliances made it nearly impossible to summarize in the space afforded an article in a gaming publication, meaning that the conflicts necessarily had to be simplified in order to both be made intelligible and concise enough to fit within the restrictive word limits. Many of those who read these articles became enamored with the concept of partaking in such massive record-breaking battles and began signing up for EVE themselves. For CCP, war was good for business. But those who were fighting the war were facing unprecedented problems. Nate Combs, in a blog from 2007 titled NBSI and the Grey Problem, writes that, quote, "Members within an alliance are marked by varying colors. Green means that fellow is a corporation member, blue he's part of the alliance, etc. Degrees of separation, even among buddies. red in several flavors distinguishes shades of bad guy. The problem is with the gray. One of the trickiest herding cats problem in running alliances is making sure everyone is on the same page about the rules of engagement. Go to any alliance forum and ask what the current rules are, and you will hear a number of answers. Folks get confused about what they should do with the gray, and in the absence of knowing what they should do, they do what they think is right, which can be all over the board. Inconsistency is a hobgoblin to both sides of the gray divide. The good gray don't like going into areas where they are uncertain about who is on the same page, and alliances don't like grays getting into some areas. Some grays may turn out to be bad apples. To make the problem worse, some alliances may vary their policy towards the gray over time and circumstance. For example, when tensions are high, an alliance may enter lockdown mode, and its policy becomes one of shooting the gray first and ask questions later. During more peaceful times, the policy may be changed to be nice to encourage trade. It gets worse. Some of the very large alliances may have different policies for the different regions it controls. Talk about a headache if you're one of the few players, e.g. traders, who might travel great distances. Another problem with the gray is that it is an alliance/corp-centric perspective. It is a first-person measure. You are neutral to me now. I may be, however, enemies to your friend, and that can lead to a more complicated relationship. End quote. These problems were only growing greater. Trade had been a key element that allowed the early nullsec corporations to build their first titans, but the war raging was now making them more and more wary of neutrals, who could be traders or enemy infiltrators. But these problems were being amplified in an important new way. After the collapse of Uli as a trade hub, traders returned to the 4 different corners of Empire space in the north, south, east, and west. In particular, they gravitated towards stations that hosted the best mission givers. While trading NPC goods had gradually been phased out and the player economy was allowed to supplant it, players could still earn money from NPCs through missions, and they tended to congregate within the stations that housed the highest earning missions. Entrepreneurial traders would offer weapons, ammunition, and ships for sale in these stations, hoping to sell to the wealthier mission runners at these convenient locations. However, more than just the mission runners were searching for these goods, and soon a wider clientele was congregating around these stations as well. Recognizing this, more traders looking to sell their goods began placing their contracts alongside the others, even if they were unrelated to running missions, hoping to sell to those visiting the station. And so, the trade hubs established themselves and grew. Of the different trade hubs, the one that received the most traffic was the Alldayerrydaybaby Navy Assembly Plant, located around the 4th moon of the 4th planet of Jita. The higher population in the northern regions of Empire space was due in large part to the attributes of characters. When creating a character, players are allowed to choose between the 4 different NPC empires: Amar, Minmatar, Galente, and Caldari, and of the 4, Caldari were by far the most popular race for players due to their favorable attribute distribution, given that attributes determine how quickly a character can learn skills, and skills determine what characters are capable of performing. Soon, much like Uli before it, the system of Jita was host to hundreds of players every day looking to trade, and it was growing rapidly.
Come on,
But
man.
this time, Crowd Control Productions would be prepared. Since they had broken the Stargate links in Uli, they had been working on the server backend, as they realized that they would need to prepare for far more success than they had anticipated when they launched EVE Online. On March 1st, 2006, CCP Games announced a patch transferring the game onto new servers which utilized brand new, state-of-the-art AMD chips. Rather than trying to scatter the players again, now they would be doing all that they could to accommodate a naturally occurring trade hub. Soon, a single server would be dedicated exclusively to the system of Jita to manage the massive influx of traffic, as well as some permanent residents who began to participate in the day trading of commodities. With trade now being allowed to centralize, this also meant that if a particular commodity crashed, then it crashed for everyone in the game at once, with little recourse. But while this new trade hub was located in Empire space, its establishment significantly affected the culture of Nullsec. The northern regions had always been wealthy due to their natural resources and general proximity to HighSec, but the emergence of Jita guaranteed much easier access to what would soon become the undisputed center of the economy in New Eden, given that Jita was less than 10 Stargate jumps away from the nearest northern nullsec systems. Trading between Empire space and the northern regions only became easier as time passed. But the inverse was true for the southern regions. The distance between Jita and Del, for example, was many times longer, and where they once had been able to trade with Empire space easily, they now had to travel much farther to sell their goods. As time passed, those nullsec alliances living in the south would begin to develop their own internal economies. Leaders would encourage their alliance members to trade exclusively with one another, in many cases creating not only an economic, but a cultural divide between the players in the southern regions and the players in the rest of New Eden. But in the in-between spaces, an entirely new sort of dynamic was evolving, one forgotten by most. Over the years, the dynamics of the game had shifted radically. As players gained more and more capital, and as the merchant races were
This is good, I'm enjoying
this
this immensely.
Player economy, piracy was no longer making nearly as much money, and often players would lose more money than they gained by hunting other players. Many, such as the aforementioned mercenaries, abandoned the practice in favor of fulfilling contracts for clients. What's more, the nullsec alliances were growing into empires, and these empires often patrolled and defended their territory, stamping out any piracy not perpetrated by their own members. The only
Please kill him.
space left for these players
Please
was
kill him.
low security space.
Oh god, that was scary.
Nullsec. But when they moved, their paradigm gradually began to shift. Now that piracy was no longer making the players much money, the only ones who continued the practice
Almost lost
did
again.
so
Gotta
for
watch
the
that
love of
level.
it. In an interview for Down the Rabbit Hole, a prominent player and leader named Phantomite spoke to the role that those in LowSec adopted. Quote, "I feel like me killing people in LowSec isn't piracy, I think it's just PvP. It's not a profession, I don't really earn any money from it. The fact that the game calls what you're doing illegal means that there's some kind of weird dishonor involved that's different to catching a traveler in nullsec. It's just PvP." End quote. Those players who decided to stay were the only ones dedicated enough to continue their piracy, in part due to a particular feature. Early after the release of the game, CCP launched a feature called kill mails, which were permanent in-game records of ship destruction, issued to both the destroyed party and those involved in destroying them, and many players began to covet these kill mails and collect them like trading cards, with certain ships or players being more or less prestigious. While this wasn't always the primary motivating factor
Your skill
for
has
those
increased.
hunting other players, it did mean that they could keep a record of their experiences doing so, ensuring an official method of tracking prestige. But the kill mails introduced another dynamic: loss aversion. Since kill mails were public, one's victories and losses were both available to any who wanted to see them, and a loss was often considered a shame in the eyes of the community, at least to the player who lost the ship. On this, Phantomite said, quote, "I feel it is socially unacceptable to lose in this game. If you lose a fleet fight to begin with, in local, the winning side will almost always jeer at you and be a bad winner, mock you for having dared to lose a fight in EVE Online. It's not congratulations on winning, it's you idiots, you lost. How stupid do you feel right now?" Especially as group sizes get larger, there's a lot of bitterness on both sides. End quote. On the opposite end of the spectrum, a group of players have been growing in size, prominence, and role in the greater EVE community. Early in the game's lifetime, a health chat was implemented so that players could offer assistance to other players learning the game, but many found that this limited forum was insufficient due to the complexity of EVE. And so, a new player-run institution was formed, EVE University. Its primary impetus was to assist new players by teaching them the basic mechanics as well as good practices with hands-on experience. While other corporations would sometimes invite new players and assist them so that they could swell their ranks and achieve greater goals, EVE University had few such aspirations. Rather, uniquely, it declared itself a neutral body who would not take sides in any wars.
What was
Those
that?
members, known as students or unistas, were free to do as they pleased whenever they chose to leave. Many years later, in an interview with the online EVE news site Crossing Zebras, a new CEO, Asmodeus Valar, said that, quote, EVE University exists to give new players a place to learn about EVE in a supportive community. We maintain neutrality so that our students can move on to whatever section of EVE interests them. End quote. But this neutrality would quickly come to be a limiting factor. In October of 2005, EVE University founded a new alliance called the Big Blue and sought to hold territory in Nullsec. But after less than a year, an unknown client hired mercenary coalition to evict them for unclear reasons. Another reflection of the growing necessity for corporations to ally themselves with one another in order to survive the growing turbulence of Nullsec. EVE University's policy of neutrality wouldn't allow them the partnerships with the larger groups that they required. Unwilling to compromise on this defining feature, EVE University decided to base themselves in high-security space instead, and partnered with other corporations in a new alliance which they named Ivy League, in part to protect themselves from the vast number of war declarations that they were suffering. As a group comprised primarily of new players learning from a smaller number of more seasoned players, declaring war on EVE University was an easy way for more aggressive and less discerning players to gather easy kill mails. Despite these hazards, EVE University began to grow as a foundational part of New Eden's social landscape, with corporations seeking out those who had spent time learning in it. Their decision to retire from Nullsec would become a practically permanent one on June 19, 2009, when CCP released their expansion, Revelations 2. With this expansion, powerful defensive sovereignty bonuses would be granted to anyone who owned over half of the structures within a system for 28 days. Once this had been achieved, a structure called a Sinojammer could be built in the system, disallowing any player from lighting a cynosural field within the system. While capital ships could use stargates, they were choke points in which they could easily be caught, and the only practical way of bringing a capital ship into a fight was through the use of cynosural fields. By restricting their use, it meant that any alliance attacking a system with a high enough sovereignty bonus could only do so with subcapital ships, an effectively impossible task against any active alliance. This meant that Nullsec alliances were now much more stable in their ownership of territory, as long as they possessed enough capital ships. The major factions in Nullsec had now been set. With the base mechanics, the social groups, and the varying playstyles within EVE all growing more complicated and nuanced by the day, the development team recognized that they wouldn't be able to keep track of all of them and balance them alone. And so, in late 2007, Crowd Control Productions announced the establishment of the Council of Stellar Management, a body of players elected by the player base to communicate their interests directly to the company. Early in the game's lifetime, CCP had requested that players join the developers to speak about the game, but they had been handpicked after applying, as opposed to the more democratic method of the council. Of the 97 applications, 33 were rejected for varying reasons, including behavioral and technical, leaving 64 to be voted on by the community in a first-past-the-post system, where the 14 players with the most votes would be elected. A PDF document written by CCP Representative Petter Johannes Oscarsson details the role and responsibilities of the Council of Stellar Management, but not before spending over half of the document on what he called a comparative analysis of real structural social evolution with the virtual society of EVE Online. In the opening paragraphs, he wrote, quote, "The only consensus in the study of socio-cultural evolution is that no single theory can aptly describe the universal development and progression of any society. Myriad factors ranging from geographical location to religious beliefs and even weather conditions, prevailing or roguish, all complicated the analysis. Introducing the most subtle variable could drastically alter the course of two societies that would have otherwise evolved along similar paths. Thus, it is these general paths, or unilinear milestones, that this paper will draw real-world comparisons from. The purpose of the analogy is to establish the foundation for implementing a deliberative, democratically elected council in EVE. This is by no means an endorsement of any social evolution theory. A comparison with actual civilizations is beyond the scope of this analysis. But it will demonstrate the striking similarities between this theory of real-life societal development and the virtual society evolution of EVE, while also
Your skill has
relying on
increased.
one key assumption about individuals in both realms, that they are motivated by the pursuit of value, the core of which is driven by their instinct for survival." End quote. While this document was likely meant to help instill within the EVE community the impression that CCP was
Your
taking
skill has
seriously
increased.
their responsibilities toward the game, it also illustrated the divide that was growing between the players and their game world's caretakers, despite their attempts to the contrary. While the majority of the player base was primarily interested in simply having fun by playing the game on the most minute level, the developers saw themselves as being on the cusp of a newly developing world that reflected elements of the human condition, similar to the way that the founding members of CCP had attempted to create a new internet interface with the virtual reality markup language during their time at Oz Virtual. Oscarsson wrote in the document that, quote, "Until now, comparisons of political philosophy and social structures in the virtual world have been drawn from parallels with the real one. But it cannot be stressed enough that today, with this many people comprising the civilization of EVE, and the potential ripple effect of any change in the way this society is governed, further legislative applications based mostly on CCP's interpretation of the real world are likely to cause more harm than good. To achieve continued success, EVE society must be granted a larger role in exerting influence on the legislative powers of CCP. Governance of virtual worlds is a unique endeavor. There is no precedence to follow." The responsibilities for the Council of Stellar Management were more than might typically be expected from a group of player consultants, which perhaps helps to explain the small number of applicants. Quote, "At least twice a year, CCP will convene multi-day summit meetings in Reykjavik. In addition, each year CCP holds its FanFest convention. 7 members of the CSM attend these events in person. Council terms will last 12 months, and elections will follow the expiration of each term. This timeframe corresponds roughly to the expansion release cycles of EVE Online." End quote. These council members would be privy to restricted knowledge so that they could give their unique perspectives as players. What sort of effect they would have on the game, however, was yet to be seen. The importance of such communication with the player community was exemplified by the proliferation of player-made tools that were seeing widening popularity. On July 22nd, 2008, a player going by the name Wallari created a post on the official EVE forums in which he announced the release of a map of EVE Online named Dotland. Quote, in the last weeks, I created a system to arrange and generate region maps for EVE. After some hard work on the backend and positioning the systems, I can finally announce a new type of EVE regions maps. The maps are focused to be clean and easy readable with the most important information for fleet roaming and planning. They contain daily sovereignty and outpost information for your favorite 0.0 space. Also, occupancy informations for the new factional warfare are included. End quote. What's more, this tool would be offered for free to any EVE player who wanted to use it, hosted on its own website. Importantly, this map wasn't updated manually. Rather, it pulled information from EVE Online's backend servers in order to update it, meaning that they would update in real time, and Dotland's maps would quickly become the standard. And when players wanted to share
Dotland for the motherfucking win. Used it a lot.
Rather than using the in-game map, the clean,
Back when I was
clear
maining.
maps on Dotland would almost always be used. This was far from the only tool developed by players to help others play the game. In 2006, a group of resourceful coders had released a tool which they named EveMon, which acted as a way to manage a character and plan their ever-important skills, which restricted what a character could do and what sort of innate bonuses they wielded. Like Dotland, EveMon pulled information from the back-end servers of EVE Online, allowing players to see aspects of their characters such as their skills, their stats, their total skill points accrued, and their ISK balance, all without having to open the game. These sorts of tools helped further erode the feeling of separation between the game and real life, since the game world could be reflected in places other than the game window. Rather than fight these tools, CCP supported their use and would sometimes even showcase them on their website. It was around this time as well that the listless and much poorer pirates in low security space would be given a new purpose. On June 10th,
Fucked me, you fucked me on this.
CCP
Your skill has
released the
increased.
extension Empyrean Age. Among the other changes, the
Damn
one
it.
that attracted the
Come
most
on, you
attention
kinda
was the
fucked me on that,
introduction of
man.
a new opportunity
God
for
damn it.
players called factional warfare. After signing up to fight for one of the 4 in-game non-player empires that ruled over high-security empire space, they would be given
see if I have any
objectives
money.
in low-security space to capture in the name of the empire that they had chosen.
And now I have
But
10k.
importantly,
Yeah,
they
I'm doing
would
pretty
not
good.
only be fighting
Oh god,
against
are you
NPCs,
saying I'm aggroed? You
they would
are,
also be
oh
facing
god.
other players who had sworn allegiance
Run,
to
run,
a
run, run, run,
different
run, run,
enemy
run.
faction. In this way, players in Empire space could fight with other players in a structured
Oh, thank God.
yet accessible fashion. While factional warfare itself held little interest for the pirate corporations in LowSec, it meant that far more players
Apprentice
would be
Clothier.
ushered into their domain. As the less experienced players from high-sec wandered into low-sec in order to complete their objectives, roving bands of low-sec pirates would catch individuals and small fleets unaware, swooping in to rapidly dispatch those looking to engage in factional warfare. These pirates had become a part of the landscape of low-sec, maintaining a level of
Let's see if I have
unavoidable
any money.
danger to the game.
I need that
and
damn
the introduction
charm.
of factional
Pretty
warfare
bad.
had reinvigorated them. Evading pirates was a skill in which traders and industrialists prided themselves, and it was common to hear such peaceful players breathlessly recount their experiences avoiding and outwitting them. But soon, the game would see an addition that would further complicate it, crossing the border between the real world and the virtual world of New Eden in a way that would eventually make its feelings the subject of international attention and awe. In November of 2008, CCP announced the release of a new form of currency. As was common practice, players could either buy cards at local stores or have cards mailed to them, which they could redeem to extend their membership, allowing them continued access to the game. For EVE, much like other games of its kind, the monthly fee was $15, with discounts when bought in larger increments. However, CCP was now offering a new function for these cards. When a player bought one,
The mass graves southwest of Garen's Haunt to the north were made to accommodate the impressive number of deaths Tirisfal suffered when the plague first came. The bodies in these graves have so far been spared an undeath, but the Scourge now send Rothhide gnolls to gather the corpses and use them to bolster their armies. This cannot be allowed. Your task is twofold. Slay the Rothides at the mass grave and Garen's Haunt, and gather from them the embalming ichor that gives them life.
Do not rest your weary bones for a spell. Rest your weary bones
But there
for a
was
spell.
one major, important
Rest your weary bones for a
Since the
spell.
Plex was an in-game item, it could be bought and sold on the player market, and whoever bought the Plex could redeem it for their own character, meaning that a player with enough in-game money could effectively pay for their subscription by buying Plex from other players with in-game money. The most obvious effect was that it gave many players a goal: make enough in-game money to pay for their
8,500.
own subscription
Oh, yeah.
month to month by buying Plex from other players, effectively playing for free. But for those on the outside looking in, it gave something much more important. Game subscription cards for EVE Online could typically be bought for $35 and offered 2 months of subscription, which meant that they could be redeemed for 2 Plex. This gave Plex a stable, real-world value of approximately $17. Since Plex would be bought and sold in-game for ISK, the in-game currency, and the real-world value of 1 Plex was relatively consistent, this meant that there was a way to track the real-world value of the in-game currency without having to refer to the black market price, which was subject to fluctuation, and which many sources were reluctant to acknowledge or reference because of its inherently opaque nature. What's more, because of the stability of the price of Plex in the real world, the gradual inflation of the value of ISK could be tracked as well. Such aspects only enhance the interest of mainstream publications, including Forbes, a popular and well-regarded business magazine, which had already been paying attention to EVE Online due in part to the business-themed naming scheme of its player structures. An article from 2008 by Matthew Kierdehy, named From MMO to CEO, reads in part, quote, Sean Conover has 2 jobs. One is at a computer forensics lab in suburban New Jersey. The other is in a fantastical galaxy inhabited by 25,000 intelligent life forms.
They used to talk like this a lot.
and
Your other life, you might be an emperor, god, king, and we all bought it, and I bought it hook, line, and sinker, and then I went through 20 empires. I was like, yeah, being an empire is kind of boring, or emperors being kind of boring. I'd rather just like have fun.
place, he takes orders. In the other, he gives
He
them.
makes them.
There
Yeah,
are many
yeah.
more like Conover, and with good reason. It's in this virtual space where tomorrow's business leaders are being born. Mom may mock video games no more.
Not mom.
End quote. The EVE player interviewed for this article was the notable figure Darius Johnson.
I have 18
the
grand.
leader
That
of
I think that's
Goonswarm
enough.
and
We'll
the
go
greater
see.
Goonswarm Alliance. For the last year and a half, Goonswarm and their allies, the Russians hailing from the northeastern corner of the
Fucking
map, had
Goonswarm.
been continuing their war against Band of
Fucking
Brothers, and during
Goonswarm.
that time, they had become
Fucking
known for their
Goonswarm.
effective, if obnoxious, propaganda. Beyond the
I wonder
posters, there
if
were often
Frederick Knudsen is
photoshopped versions
Goonswarm,
of
because he
World
seems
War
to be
II propaganda
pretty
posters
Goonswarm-centric
that
here.
Tommy had taken to
It
regularly
wouldn't surprise
post on
me.
his blog about the war, both to rally the goons and guide the public perception to bolster morale and increase membership. and
Fucking
this gave
goon swarm,
mainstream
the
news
Mittani
outlets
and
an
all this.
easy way to monitor the war, albeit through a heavily biased source. Even knowing this bias, this meant that as publications such as Forbes and The Guardian wrote about EVE Online, it was often through the paradigm and context of the goons. External news outlets also helped to personalize the leaders. Furthering Kirdahi's article, he writes, quote, "When Conover gets home from his 9-to-5 job, he logs onto a virtual world as Darius Johnson, chief executive of Goonfleet.
Darius Johnson. I've got a Darius Johnson for you.
100 players in EVE. The leadership experience has challenged Conover the same way the modern CEO is challenged. He worries about economics, employee morale, production,
If he's a
training, and
loser.
even a succession plan, which he's devising. After all, the next guy has to be able
If he
to
worries
manage
about that
his
shit,
own too. And
how good is
in
I mean, how good is
particular,
could his
the
life
term
be?
failure cascade had become common in New Eden, popularized by the
kidding.
Mittani, and quickly adopted
Oh, God.
by news
Are you gonna
outlets
kill
who were
me? Don't
already
kill me.
heavily
I'm so
reliant
scared.
on his writing
Oh
and
God, I
discussion
almost did
feeds.
die. I almost
In
did
an
die.
article
Look.
from 2009,
Oh,
Mittani
God.
wrote, quote,
Wait,
"In
how do
the
you get off
past
this
4
thing?
years,
Oh, God.
I've witnessed
Oh.
more than 20
Ooh.
alliances disintegrate, and I've had the benefit of directly orchestrating a good number of those. Better than just hammering at them from the outside, I've been able to witness
gonna kill
the
me? Oh,
progress
God.
from the inside concurrently by way of our spy network. While watching Lotka Volterra explode in much the same way Veritas Immortalis had,
I gotta
dubbed
watch
this
elevators
death
much more
cycle the
carefully.
failure cascade, due to the way in which the process rapidly accelerates from small errors into thermonuclear drama. Delightfully enough,
Be
even
quick
our
about
most
your
vehement
business.
enemies have chosen to use my nomenclature, as well as the more traditional media. Apparently, the term has some pre-existing engineering use, but Googling it now turns up mostly yammering about spaceships. He went on to define the term. Quote, "A failure cascade is the disintegration of an alliance caused by collective helplessness in the face of sustained and unrationalizable adversity through a process of pilot attribution shifting from the alliance to the corporation or the individual." End quote. Both Crowd Control Productions and Goonswarm were facing prodigious growth, and both were simultaneously taking great risks in attempts to reap great rewards.
I'm listening.
Black screen.
It had been over 2 years since the death of Steve the Titan, and still the war in Nullsec continued, involving every major power. And after numerous movements of the battle line back and forth, Band of Brothers had been pushed all the way back into their home region of Delve. To their north, the Northern Coalition had recovered from total
What is it?
destruction, retaken territory, and went on the offensive after fighting back the forces of
I
mercenary
clawed my way
coalition
out of the
who had been
grave.
fighting
I
the
thought
war
my
for
family
Band of
would welcome me
Brothers,
with
but
open arms.
eventually abandoned them
Instead,
in order to
they drove me
establish
from the
themselves
village,
in new
screaming in a
territory
language
and
I could no
continue
longer
their existence
understand.
as guns for hire. Meanwhile, from the east, the forces of Goonswarm and their allies, the Red Alliance,
I can train you
continued
in
to
first
strike.
aid techniques.
Previously, the Russians of the Red Alliance had joined Goonswarm in an effort to defeat Band of
And the
Brothers,
race.
but after this effort failed, they retreated to their home regions in the southeast to live next door to the Goons. With their forces combined, their territory was nearly impossible for any alliance to assail. Typically, the Russians were cagey, reclusive, and distrustful, but they had joined Goonswarm to defeat their common enemies in Band of Brothers. But now that Band of Brothers have been fought back to Fortress Delve, the war had reached a standstill. Delve's epithet was well earned. It had served as the home region for Band of Brothers for years now, and was nigh unassailable due to the coordination of Band of Brothers fleets and the system's solid sovereignty bonuses, which practically restricted any enemy fleet from fielding anything larger than a dreadnought in Band of Brothers territory. Multiple Titans had been lost by both sides, but Band of Brothers still had enough capital
Multiple
ships to
Titans.
bounce back any assault on its borders. And if the smaller capital ships weren't enough, then the combined might of 8 simultaneous doomsday blasts from Band of Brothers' 8 remaining Titans would be enough to turn any fight. Without the ability to field their own Titans, the rest of Nullsec could do little to penetrate into Delve. But in early 2009, this state of affairs suddenly and radically changed. One of the high-ranking members of Band of Brothers, Hargoth Agamar, had tired of the other leaders and joined Goonswarm, offering to help them in whatever way they could. After some rumination, Goonswarm's spymaster, the Mittani, devised a plan of action. Andrew Groen chronicled what transpired in Empires of Eve. Quote, "On the night of February 4th, 2009, Hargoth Agamar logged into EVE Online and docked his ship at the headquarters of Black Nova Corporation, one of the main member corporations of Band of Brothers. From Band of Brothers, Hargoth stole 50
Gonna get my necklace
dreadnoughts
finally.
and an entire
It's
ship
good.
hangar containing hundreds of smaller ships. He also stole a huge amount of
It's weird. It's as if that keybind isn't working anymore. It's weird.
strontium, starbase, and dreadnought fuel. With a few clicks, he stole everything his corporation owned. In the empty hangar folders, he left just a single
20K.
item, a note with
Damn
one
it.
sentence written on it.
I'm close, but I don't have it.
Mittani sends his regards. When he was done with his theft, he went to work, ending the entire alliance. He removed the other directors from their positions.
No, that's
and
okay. We'll
closed
go
the
back to
alliance.
work.
With no alliance on record named Band of Brothers, every one of its sovereignty claims was instantly dropped. Band of Brothers had claimed sovereignty.
I wonder if I can get around a
every
charisma
system in
cap
Delve,
cheaply.
but after Hargoth Agamar's
No, I don't
death,
need to.
There was no
I don't need
longer
to.
an alliance called Band of Brothers. As a result, all of the star bases owned by Bob went offline without an alliance to control them. Their capital systems were no longer invulnerable, and they had no way to stop enemy alliances from bringing heavy artillery right into the heart of Band of Brothers' empire." End quote. The rest of New Eden now had a 28-day window to capture enough territory to prevent Band of Brothers from regaining their sovereignty, but only Goonswarm was in a position to capitalize on this, and simply destroying Band of Brothers was no longer enough for them. The leader of Goonswarm, Darius Johnson, ordered that all assets in Alliance territory be brought to the front lines in preparation for a fight in Delve, where they would either drive out Band of Brothers and claim Delve as their new home, or be left destitute. This would also help to fend off enemies, at least for a time. During the war, the general unpleasantness of both the Russian alliances and Goonswarm had resulted in enough feuds that they had broken their treaties with one another, and a significant contingent of Russians had joined forces with Band of Brothers, sandwiching the Goons between the two. There were also rumors and accounts of real money being paid to players to alter the political landscape, but the complete abandonment of territory by Goonswarm guaranteed that the Russians would be preoccupied with claiming all of the territory that had once belonged to the Goons, as they threw themselves recklessly at Band of Brothers, at least for the first few weeks. No other alliance seems to have been warned of this opportunity, and it would take time to mobilize. Now, Goonswarm would launch a blitzkrieg the likes of which had never been seen in EVE Online. But as Goonswarm was beginning its invasion, the game would see a radical change, and the denizens of this particular edition would soon exist outside of the paradigm and culture of any other part of New Eden. On March 10,
What do you
2009, CCP announced the release of the Apocrypha expansion. Among other changes, including a higher tier of specialized ships, this update introduced wormholes. These anomalies, functionally, were short-lived entrances into an entirely new cluster of star systems, but the wormholes would only survive for a maximum of a few days before collapsing permanently, and new ones
24 hours. Not a few days. 24 hours. He's not an E player.
These systems boasted no stargates. Rather, they were connected to one another. And
He probably played it back in the
stars
day, but
New Eden exclusively
he might
with
talk
a
about it.
network of wormholes, and the transient and
24
unpredictable
hours.
nature of these wormholes created an ever-shifting labyrinth. Despite the vast new territory now made available, players were tentative to venture into it for several reasons. First, finding the wormholes was a
I do not
challenge
have time to
itself.
waste, stranger.
In order to
State your
discover a
business or
wormhole,
be
the
off.
player had to make use of the new scanning tools, which required new skills that took time for characters to learn. The systems themselves, however, were remarkably dangerous. Much like Nullsec, Concord offered no protection in wormhole space, and so anyone traveling through a wormhole could easily be attacked upon arrival by other players looking for a fight. Even then, however, the points of interest found through a wormhole were often remarkably dangerous. Fighting and looting NPCs would require a well-equipped squad of players, and the anomaly sites placed for explorers often were similarly defended. What's more, if a player lacked the requisite knowledge, and was unlucky, it was possible for a wormhole to collapse behind them after entering it, leaving them stranded in unknown and hostile territory, and the only method of escape was to wander aimlessly until discovering a wormhole that would take them back to New Eden, though likely far from where they had entered. Most had little interest in investigating beyond peeking out of curiosity. But there were others who saw potential in this new, unexplored region. Though the danger in wormhole space was higher, the materials there were commensurately valuable, as the gases required to make the new highest-tier ships could only be found there. And so, mining gas clouds became an important, if small, part of the EVE economy. Paradoxically, due in part to the random nature of wormholes, gas became a reliable resource, as it was difficult for aggressive players to attack others harvesting gas. Much like wormholes, gas clouds would spawn randomly and had to be scanned down with probes before their location was revealed, meaning that a reasonably attentive gas miner could spot the probes with a directional scan and escape long before any danger manifested. Beyond these more systemic limitations, there was another hard limitation that restricted the use of overwhelming force in wormhole space. The wormholes themselves could only accommodate ships below a certain size, and after a certain amount of mass passed through a wormhole, it would collapse, meaning that the massive fleets and large ships wielded by the Nullsec powers were practically useless in this new, chaotic region. The ease and safety with which gas could be harvested, and the difficulty that established corporations would have utilizing their vast wealth and resources, meant that this territory was far more accessible to less wealthy players and corporations, in contrast to Nullsec, which was now crowded with belligerent and exclusive factions. Most large corporations were also still embroiled in the ongoing war against Band of Brothers, and had few resources left to engage with wormholes. Given this, and the wide breadth of territory now available, smaller groups of players began to move into these wormholes and establish presences there, deploying starbases and storing fleets of ships. Those who chose to live in this territory were given a simple moniker: wormholers. The interests of these early wormholers varied widely, but all of them were inspired by a sense of adventure and the excitement of uncertainty.
Cornholers.
Many took the time to explore this new space and study the rules by which it functioned, and over time, the players were able to divine certain patterns. For example, many wormhole systems had what they called a static hole, which would always link to the same kind of system. A static high-sec hole, for instance, meant that there was always a wormhole leading to high-security space in the system, and if the one leading to high-sec collapsed, then another would take its place, leading to another high-security system. However, such static holes to high-sec were at a premium, And so, sometimes, multiple small corporations would deploy star bases in the same system. But since few had the resources to prosecute any sort of significant conflict, and nobody would benefit from harassing one another, many of them entered into gentlemen's agreements to not attack one
Gentlemen's
another unless agreeing
agreements.
to fight for sport. These agreements were the first manifestation of the code of honor by which wormholers would play, known earnestly, derisively, and sarcastically as Wormhole Bushido, named for the code by which Japanese samurai warriors would live. But while players were exploring the new aspects of EVE Online,
They would lose
Control
ships.
Productions was working on an entirely new game. In August of 2009, CCP Games announced their next project set in the EVE universe, a first-person shooter named Dust 514. Speculation about the gameplay was overshadowed by the fact that Dust 514 would do more than share a setting with EVE Online. Events in Dust 514 would directly impact those playing the MMO, and those playing the MMO could affect battles in Dust. The gaming news publication
Dust is so
GameSpot
cool.
quoted Hilmar Pedersen as saying, "The primary gameplay features brutal ground combat that takes place on the surface of planets. Dust 514 is the infantry, and an EVE Online player can contract a Dust team to go in and take control of a planet. The fleet does the flying, the infantry does the dying." End quote. Guy Cocker, writing for GameSpot, went on to say that, quote, "The game has been under development for 3 years at CCP Shanghai, with input from other CCP studios worldwide.
188.
We questioned
Damn.
Pedersen about the platforms the game is being developed for, as well as subscription details, but he declined to comment at this time. But it was confirmed that the game was being developed for current generation hardware." End quote. After revealing some gameplay at the annual FanFest in October of that year, Hilmar Pedersen proudly spoke with IGN further about the game. Quote, "Dust 514 is first and foremost a first-class FPS mixed with real-time strategy elements and persistent world components, which are innovative in their own right. Still, the biggest innovation in Dust 514 is that the outcome of battles directly affects the resource and power controls in EVE Online. This will significantly enhance the gaming experience that our current 300,000 subscribers enjoy by adding a whole new level of gameplay elements that they can affect. At its core, Dust 514 is a first-person shooter with run-and-gun gameplay. But there is a heavy emphasis on vehicular combat that layers tactical and strategic dimensions within each battle. In addition, weapons and modules are upgradable in real time, which we believe pushes Dust 514 beyond what has been seen in the market so far." End quote. Notable features were map sizes measuring 5 kilometers squared and, perhaps most importantly, the ability for Dust mercenaries to take control over certain regions of planets for corporations in EVE Online, or for Dust corporations to take those sections of planets for themselves. Early gameplay footage shown at FanFest was promising and elicited excited reactions from the crowd, despite its limited scope. But as players were anticipating the new battles to be had in Dust 514, the years-long war in Nullsec was finally reaching its conclusion, and the aftermath would permanently alter the social landscape of New Eden. After such an extended period of direct conflict, the alliances in Nullsec had grown skilled at husbanding their resources and managing their fleets, the latter of which had grown into affairs often involving hundreds of people on both sides. This new method of waging warfare placed greater importance on management rather than moment-to-moment battles. But managing such a vast number of players was a difficult task. Unlike an army of professional soldiers or paid employees, the people who comprised the fleets in EVE Online were playing in their spare time, and the most effective way to form a fleet was for the fleet commander to put out a call to their alliance, asking for people to join for a potential fight. the number of people who joined was never certain. The attendance of individuals could change due to real-life factors, interest in the upcoming battle, or simply due to the waxing and waning of engagement with the game, making morale a key factor to the cohesion of alliances. If morale dropped low enough, then people would simply not answer calls for fleets or even leave their corporations entirely. If a corporation leader lost faith in their alliance, then they could take their entire corporation
You're
with
being gonna
them
pee.
when they left. Despite the overwhelming importance of morale, the most effective ways to wage war in EVE Online were often far from entertaining for the individual. It was common for a fleet commander to call for a fleet, form up in position, move from location to location, or even keep the fleet stationary for hours, and then disband the fleet due to a lack of need. As fleets grew more expensive and the need for strategic dominance prevailed over the desire for action, the impetus to engage in equal fights or even slightly favorable fights diminished due to loss aversion, and given the responsibilities bestowed upon fleet commanders, there was little incentive to risk the large ships now demanded by war. This loss aversion worked similarly for the individual player as it did for the corporation and alliance. Few people would be willing to risk their most expensive ships in a large fight where they had little say in the outcome. A player who lost a capital ship once may simply have decided that it wasn't worth the risk of joining a fleet. To mitigate this, many corporations enacted measures called Ship Replacement Programs, or SRPs. When a player lost a ship while participating in operations with the corporation, they could submit a claim.
We are 7 hours
and
into a
reimburse
14-hour
their loss,
session.
either in part or in full, paid with the money gathered from passive income, such as moon mining. This passive income was part of the reason why Band of Brothers could fund such an extensive war while fighting on multiple fronts and maintaining morale. But now that Goonswarm, through subterfuge, had eliminated the sovereignty that insulated Band of Brothers from its enemies, it would soon become nearly impossible to maintain a solid line of defense for its vulnerable economic center. What's more, Goonswarm had ensured the morale of their members by abandoning their own territory and claiming that of Band of Brothers as their own, drawing from the classic Chinese treatise The Art of War. As translated by Lionel Giles, one prominent section reads, quote, "Throw your soldiers into positions whence there is no escape, and they will prefer death to flight. If there is no place of refuge, they will stand firm. If they are in hostile country, they will show a stubborn front." End quote. It is with this tenacity that Goonswarm descended upon the territory of Band of Brothers, striking at all constituent corporations at once, attempting to break their will before the sovereignty bonuses returned, and once again made invasion impossible. This would be expedited by a massive mistake made by Band of Brothers. Andrew Rowan details the mistake in Empires of Eve. Quote, "Band of Brothers ordered every one of its capital ship pilots to log off at an open NPC-controlled station in PRTAC 8CA in Delve. However, Goonswarm spies found out about the massive stockpile of warships and called in their allies to organize a massive blockade of the station. They were able to surround the indestructible NPC station, trapping every last one of Band of Brothers' dreadnoughts and carriers inside. The blockade around Band of Brothers' fleet held for 30 days straight." End quote. By the time the Russians came to assist, it was far too late. Delve now belonged to Goonswarm, as did its vast natural resources, and this readjustment of power would come to shape the game in ways that players could scarcely predict. But even as the massive war in Nullsec was finally calming, Crowd Control Productions was planning massive additions and adjustments, one of which coincided with the end of the war in Delve. Up until the end of 2009, the presence of a Titan on the battlefield was overwhelming and oppressive due to the sheer power of its Doomsday weapon, capable of destroying nearly any non-capital ship in a 500-kilometer radius, centered on a point of the pilot's choosing. Often, when a Titan arrived, the existence of anything smaller than a dreadnought was invalidated. However, on December 1st, 2009, a significant change was made to the Titan's signature weapon. Rather than a massive area of effect, the Doomsday would now be a focused single-target burst of damage, capable of destroying or severely damaging even the largest ships in a single blast. With this change, the importance of large populations in battle was re-emphasized. A fleet of smaller subcapital ships was always necessary for capital and supercapital ships to perform well, and now that a subcapital fleet couldn't be immediately decimated upon the arrival of a Titan, greater populations of players could again become a stronger deciding factor. But more importantly for most other players, who had only a tangential attachment to nullsec, another promised feature was being touted by Crowd Control Productions, something that they had been planning for the past 3 years. Ambulation, which had been renamed the Walking In Stations. Over the past year, the company had released various teasers and discussed their goals for the project.
And what it's about giving the players a full-body avatar and the ability to exit their ships and go into space station, go to bars and corporation offices and socialize and play minigames as an embodied avatar.
However, there was some question as
Please
to the
kill him.
necessity
1
of
health.
the feature.
Oh my
The
god.
development time and work required
Can't
were
pull
remarkable,
things
but
like
players
any
were
higher
already
than me, really.
socializing using various
Wow.
out-of-game methods that were far more visible
Fucking
and
Christ,
already
man.
established, such as IRC chats and
1
even
health,
the
I can't
official
believe it.
forums. While there was
I'm
quite a bit
learning.
of excitement, there was also trepidation that it would be superfluous or add
I think 7
extraneous
is too high.
requirements to what players
Yeah, if it's
could
orange,
already do.
if it's
Crowd
yellow,
Control
it's too high,
Productions
I
grappled
think.
with how to implement walking in stations, other projects were floundering. The EVE collectible card game, which they had produced in conjunction with the recently acquired White Wolf Productions, had suffered a lukewarm reception after limited marketing.
He's
outside
7, I
of
don't want to fight him.
conventions, despite positive reviews from gaming publications. The single expansion released in 2007 had suffered a laborious release, reprinted 3 times before the cards were completed correctly, but shortly after a lackluster launch, it appears that the entire card game was abandoned. The company's other projects were also beginning to struggle. A scathing article from The Guardian in 2014 retrospectively described Crowd Control Productions as extremely disorganized when managing the staff from White Wolf. Quote, very shortly after initial development began, the company started blurring the lines between the World of Darkness and EVE projects. Repeatedly, staff were shifted over from the former to work on expansion projects for the latter. At times, our sources say the entire World of Darkness staff was put onto EVE. End quote. The problems within the team itself were numerous. Developers interviewed for the article cited problems in various areas of development, including demands for small changes that required entire rewrites, the creative vision, poor budgeting, a lack of managerial responsibility, and aggressive, hostile design meetings. Quote, most of the sources spoken to for this piece identified the same problematic CCP manager, who had little vision for what the finished game would look like. Not once could he answer any question about moment-to-moment gameplay or areas of focus, says one source. Instead, he preferred to deliver buzzword-laden rambles. It was not uncommon for him to communicate in onomatopoeia. I once saw him looking over the shoulder of a programmer at some bit of user interface the poor guy had hacked together. He straightened up, put fingers to lips, and said, no, this isn't it at all. Make it more... He hissed on his fingertips like the air coming out of a bicycle tire, and then just walked away. End quote. As the World of Darkness team struggled, work continued on Dust 514, but to properly integrate its game world with that of EVE Online, the infantry would need the planets over which they were to fight, and on May 26, 2010, this prize would be introduced in the Tyrannus expansion. With this, the pilots in EVE Online would be able to lay claim to planets and exploit their resources by establishing infrastructure, with the intention of being able to contest them with Dust 514 mercenary groups. Such resources would only increase the wealth of the existing nullsec factions and their growing industries, now able to flourish with the end of the war against Band of Brothers. But who precisely
Your
would
skill
fight
has
these
increased.
battles was still uncertain. Since 2009, Crowd Control Productions had been mum about how people would be able to play the game, only specifying that it would be made for current generation hardware, a term typically reserved for consoles. In June of 2011, the concerns of many players were confirmed. Dust 514 would be exclusive to Sony's PlayStation 3 and portable PlayStation Vita consoles. This was a peculiar choice. Beyond the difficulty of creating games for the PlayStation 3, the markets for EVE Online and first-person shooter games for consoles were remarkably different. While both attracted primarily male audiences, EVE's player base skewed older and was more interested in detailed space simulation gameplay, while console shooters were typically played by younger men who desired faster, more immediate experiences, and those in the latter audience were largely unaware of EVE. Many EVE players who otherwise might have had interest in Dust 514 didn't own a PlayStation or were unwilling to pay for the console specifically for Dust. Still, there was hope that others interested in the setting would play Dust to engage with the space sandbox. But the goodwill and hope of EVE's player base would be shaken during an incident that would capture the attention not only of those in New Eden, but the broader gaming public. On June 22nd, 2011, Crowd Control Productions released one of their most anticipated expansions, Incarna. Renamed from Walking in Stations, Incarna promised a new level of immersion for EVE players by allowing them to control their character avatars directly, and after years of advertisement, expectations were high. This was also an expansion that had drawn significant resources from other projects, as many developers had been moved from other aspects of the game and other games entirely in order to create this expansion. Blogger Wilhelm Arcturus writes in retrospect that, quote, "To get this feature, they had to not only forego working on other more core issues to the game, but pretty much had to rob the World of Darkness team of resources as well." End quote. But the immediate reception to the new additions was mixed.
Your skill
Many
has
of
increased.
The features promised with Incarna were missing to be added at a later date, and what was made available, while tantalizing, was paltry compared to the scope that Crowd Control Productions envisioned and had projected onto the player base. The two main features were a new, robust character customization process, which players could use to update their avatars, and the Captain's Quarters, which acted as a replacement for the efficient menus that players once had in their hangars. Instead, players were now required to ambulate their character models through a special room where finicky menus could be activated. In a game where menuing accounted for much of the experience, this significantly slowed the process. What's more, computer performance in this area was notably worse than the rest of the game, further hampering a now unfamiliar method of gameplay. The loneliness of the space was heightened by a locked door that promised to one day be opened so that players could enter the rest of the station and interact with other players outside of their ships in bars, clubs, and others' rooms. While not all players were fundamentally opposed to the introduction of the Captain's Quarters, its practicality was suspect, and most players opted instead for a more traditional view of their critical menus, foregoing the avatar-centric method of navigation that had been a core focus of this new development for half a decade. However, rather than being returned to the hangar view that had become a core part of EVE's aesthetic since its release, featuring the player's active ship in the center of the screen, players were instead shown a static angle of the locked station door, removing functionality from what had once been the hangar. Despite being the chief focus of development, the captain's quarters would not be the feature that would attract the most attention. Along with the more robust character creator, there were now cosmetic options for players to purchase using currency bought with real-world fiat money. However, the prices for some goods were viewed as egregious. Eve News 24 wrote, quote, "Head over to the EVE Online forums or other EVE-related sites, and it won't take you long to figure out how much buzz has been made over the fact that a monocle, or even a measly shirt, is worth more than a faction-fitted battleship, a couple of plexes, or even more than the retail box version of the EVE Online game. Enter the not-so-noble exchange shop, proof that once again CCP loses grasp of reality, as is shown by prices on the new Vanity Shop, with products like a whopping $60 for that now infamous monocle, the $22 shirt, or the designer boots, all of which might be a bit too much for many reasonable players." End quote. Players began generally expressing that this would only be the beginning of aggressive monetization on the part of Crowd Control Productions. Such suspicions were seemingly confirmed that same month when an issue of the internal company magazine Fearless was leaked, titled "Greed is Good." The first page, written by the editor Perry Desai, reads in part, quote, "As a subscription-based golden goose, EVE needs to incorporate the virtual goods sales model to allow for further revenue to fund our other titles, revenue for its developer. You." A particular article, written by the company's principal game designer Kjartan Emelson, discusses the way that player attachment to virtual goods can create capital. Quote, "An interesting aspect of selling experience and identity is that the actual action of paying for it can strengthen their perceived value. This is in many ways because of the way we are raised as consumers. We shop, therefore we are. Fashion is a beautiful example of this. When buying nice clothes, we might feel more desirable and confident, and in this way, the act of buying can actually be a factor to make your experience more meaningful or your identity stronger, and as such, it becomes more competitive with other alternatives. The act of buying is a powerful psychological pattern deeply rooted in all of us, whether we like it or not. The pure subscription model for games, even though quite well suited for the selling of holistic experiences, takes little advantage of this part of human nature. Many players will actually voice the opinion that adding any kind of consumerism to such a game will ruin their experience. Those same players will buy Plex without any qualms to get instant access to that ship they just need to have right now. And they might even go as far as buying a $500 leather jacket that matches the one their avatar is wearing. A balanced approach should acknowledge consumerism as a powerful game design tool, amongst others, that we need to get familiar with, and that should be used carefully and with respect to create more enjoyable experiences and stronger identities for our players. If successful, this will result in their increased emotional attachment to our product and services for the benefit of all. If not, we run the risk of sucking our customers dry and leaving their shriveled corpses by the side of the road to the benefit of none." End quote. The debate portion featured noticeably little debate. Both employees writing for the piece, who have been approached and requested to support a given side, espouse the value of virtual cosmetic sales for real money, disagreeing only on the measure of tangible in-game advantage that should be allowed for purchase. The writer for the Yes portion, a game designer named Christopher Toberg, wrote about his experience with the player base and their opinions on the matter. Quote, "I would like virtual goods sales in EVE. In fact, I'd like to sell a lot more than vanity items. Does this mean I'm an evil capitalist that, unless stopped, will cause the entire company to catch fire and be buried at sea by a secret team of Navy SEALs? Let's hope not, although that's the impression I get sometimes when interacting with our customers. There is a pretty overwhelming perception amongst EVE players that these changes are bad. I think they're brilliant, but our players don't. We're going to face an uphill struggle, and the reason many of us never talk about this publicly is that we'd be burned at the stake by the players. I don't really understand the logic behind it." End quote. A later part of the feature states that the company was suggesting selling faction standings, an important limiting aspect of the game. Speaking of Dust 514, a header reads, "Next summer, people will be flocking to play Dust 514. There will be an entrance fee, but we will make sure to also provide some proverbial free towels. We will be charging for the swimming goggles, though." Towards the end, it discusses the inevitability of charging players for in-game advantages for the upcoming World of Darkness. Quote, "Escalation of commitment is another key concept for the value of virtual goods sales. When a person has put time, effort, or money into something, she's more likely to be attached. If players can spend more money directly on our game, their enjoyment will heighten, and they'll bond more strongly with it." After discussing strategies to allow players to purchase an appropriate amount of in-game power, it concludes by stating, "The question of virtual goods sales is not to do or not to do. Rather, it's how do we do this? For the yet unpublished World of Darkness, the details are foggy, but the philosophy is strong." End quote. When this company magazine was leaked to the public, gaming news outlets immediately began covering it, and the community was outraged. Players took their ships to Jeddah, the trade hub of all of New Eden, and began firing at a prominent invulnerable statue to show their displeasure in a visible fashion. But arguably, the more impactful action was when thousands of players canceled their monthly subscription. Some resolved that they would do so for as long
All these
as
people
was
didn't see the
necessary
chests,
for
I
Crowd
guess.
Control Productions to change their
Nice.
minds, while others decided that, with this new direction that the company was taking, the good days of EVE Online were over, and it was time to move on to other games, or from gaming entirely. When an internal letter from CEO Hilmar Pedersen was leaked, stating that this reaction was to be expected and that the players were simply resisting change, the player base was only emboldened, and the protests continued, beginning what would be known either as the Summer of Rage or the more reductive Monocle Gate, after the exorbitant price of the Monocle cosmetic item in the store. Despite the hopes and expectations of company management, the protests showed no signs of stopping 4 months later, even after a discussion with the Council of Stellar Management. In an effort to placate their player base, Hilmar released a long apologetic letter which opened with plaintive prose. Quote,
Trust no
"Dear
one.
followers of
With the
EVE
sanction of
Online,
Lord Very
the
Much.
past few months
The
have
death
been
Your
very
store has
humbling
increased.
for me.
More
I've done
raids
much
to strike
soul
at our
searching,
enemies when they
and what
least
follows
expect
is my sincere effort to clear the air with all of you. Please bear with me as I find my way through. The estrangement from CCP that many of you have been feeling of late is my fault, and for that I am
What
truly
would you
sorry.
ask of death?
There are many contributing factors, but in the end, it is I who must shoulder the responsibility for much of what has happened. In short, my zeal for pushing Eve to her true potential made me lose sight of doing the simple things right.
Beware the
I was
living.
wrong, and I
Speak
admit
quickly.
it." End quote. The rest of the letter consisted of points of failure perceived by the player base and copious apologies. However sincere these apologies may have been, it was not enough to entirely reverse the negative perception of the company. A press release 2 weeks later revealed that what they had once internally referred to as a golden goose had stopped being quite so lucrative, and they would be reorganizing their company significantly, including laying off a fifth of their workforce. They explained that, quote, "For the immediate future, our mission is to enrich the vast EVE universe by strengthening the continuous development of EVE Online while preparing to bring Dust 514 to market on the PS3. We do this in order to realize our ambitious and challenging plan of joining the two in a cross-platform, truly massive online world. World of Darkness will continue development with a significantly reduced team. This team will continue to iterate and expand on the gameplay and systems they have designed. We will also redeploy creative teams in Atlanta to support the launch of Dust 514. End quote. But the purported gameplay and systems for World of Darkness were in a questionable state. Per the Guardian article, quote, there seemed to be no clear vision on how the various parts would create a cohesive end product.
Speak quickly.
Sources report that the game
Beware.
effectively reached alpha, the
Harmonies.
stage at which
With the
all the
sanction
major
of Lord
features have been
Verimathus,
implemented
the Deathstalkers'
3
numbers
times,
grow.
only for each
More
version
blades to
be
strike at our
scrapped.
enemies when they least
End
expect
quote.
it.
Despite confidently claiming that they still had more EVE subscribers than a year prior, it was now clear that the expectations of the executives at the company had been severely curtailed. Now, they would have to desperately struggle to maintain what they still had in EVE Online. While the state of the company would have a significant impact on the game as a whole, the conflicts in Nullsec would continue unabated. While nestling itself into its new home region of Delve, Goonswarm recognized that it would need allies in order to weather any upcoming wars, given their penchant for angering other groups of players. And so, they organized what they named the Cluster Coalition, consisting of numerous nearby corporations, often gathered together not due to affable relations with one another, but rather due to common enemies. The animosity between these groups is difficult to overstate.
It's called not trusting people. Yeah, it's simple to understand. They didn't trust each other. We won't shoot you, but that's it. That's all.
Including their full name and
You can come on our lands, we'll come on your lands, but we won't shoot you. But that's it. That's all. We don't trade. We don't trust each other, and understand we might come knock on your door the next day. You know, that's Rust. That's Eve.
In 2009, Miklani wrote an article for 10-Ton Hammer in which he stated, quote, about 2 years ago, Goonswarm was aiding our allies, Red Alliance, in the invasion of the Scalding Pass region against Lotka Volterra and their coalition. Lotka Volterra had unveiled one of the first titans against us to catastrophic consequences, and at the time these profoundly silly ships were nearly impossible to kill through legitimate in-game means. They were essentially invulnerable, with the only titans destroyed through catching the ship while the pilot was disconnected from the game. It was determined that the Enslaver and his Avatar-class titan had to go. I was approached by one of the leaders of Red Alliance to help make this happen, but almost immediately we were down the rabbit hole. Much to my surprise, the Red Alliance said they didn't want in-game information. He wanted us to use the forensic resources of our intelligence agency to track down the Enslaver's home address. At a coordinated time, armed with this information, a Russian Alliance member would apparently cut the power to the Enslaver's house in the real world, and in Eve, a Russian Alliance capital fleet would assault the abruptly pilotless Titan. Yikes. As one can imagine, I demurred, but the Russian Alliance director didn't want to take no for an answer, and I didn't fancy telling him that I thought he was completely insane. I said that I'd look into it, and that's when things began to get really crazy. Kugutsumen got involved. Kugutsumen is a French national living in Jakarta, Indonesia, who was convicted as a teenager in the early 1990s of breaking the FBI's conference call system and running up $250,000 in international calls. He copped a ban from CCP years ago for breaking the T20 scandal after penetrating the Band of Brothers director forums, but it seems the banning completely removed all restraint on his behavior regarding the game. He set up his own forum to cover the hidden news of Eve by publishing snippets from the forums of other alliances. Why didn't I have to deal with the Red Alliance trying to cut the power to the Enslaver's house to kill his Titan? Because Kugutsumen, out of either idle curiosity or malice aforethought, traced the Enslaver's IP addresses back to Iceland, confronted him on multiple Terra's TeamSpeak while under an assumed name, recorded the conversation, and then outed him as a GM and a CCP employee. End quote. But to the northeast in late 2011, the Russians, having once been relatively united, had again split due to internal divisions between the leaders of major powers, often involving what was known as RMT, or real money trading, another name for the black market economy in which wealthy players would exchange their in-game ISK for real money. Accounts from different players conflict on the prolificacy of this practice, with some leaders claiming that it was a rare occurrence, while others stated that nearly every person with a leadership position in every major alliance participated in RMT to some degree. The desire to sell ISK for real-world fiat currency was heightened for those in leadership positions who had accumulated more wealth than they could feasibly spend, and there was always a temptation to raid a corporation or alliance's assets and sell them. Many large alliances were making remarkable amounts of money
72.
by renting space controlled by the alliance to smaller corporations. An article for Gamer Tribute describes some of the conflicts of interest. Quote, certain players were rumored to make thousands of dollars in real life in RMT operations, which meant threatening renter space put real life income sources at risk for some players. End quote. While it's impossible to say for certain, the Russians had a reputation of partaking in RMT far more than other groups, which made a massive heist in July of 2011 only more bitter. A trusted and well-known leader in a Russian corporation stole nearly 1 trillion ISK worth of goods and cash, including 2,400 plex valued alone at approximately $42,000. This would not stand, and the Russian federations, who had once been relatively peaceful, fractured and declared war on one another. As these wars raged, fleet commanders began to experiment with wormholes as tactical tools, especially as an escape route in case a fight was going badly. However, given the relative unfamiliarity with wormholes, nullsec corporations would sometimes make grievous errors born from ignorance of this chaotic space. For example, after losing a fight, the elite members of Pandemic Legion, closely affiliated with Mercenary Coalition, hid their heavy battle fleet in a wormhole. However, the combined mass of their ships was too great for the wormhole to remain stable, and it collapsed behind them. None of the 46 characters who made it through the wormhole was equipped with the probes necessary to navigate a way out of wormhole space. And so, with little knowledge of wormholes, they decided instead to simply destroy one another's ships and respawn back home. Elsewhere, the dissolving of familiar alliances
Actually
meant
really
that
like
old
this.
enemies after the war were far more vulnerable, and wars began to break out all across nullsec, with wild border adjustments on a regular basis. Not even Uniswarm was able to hold on to its prize of Delve. As these wars became larger in scope and game-related writing began to resemble more traditional news outlets, web traffic began to funnel into more professionally produced operations, but these outlets were often controlled by groups with special interests. Most obviously, the Mittani, a website owned and operated by its namesake, with writers creating all kinds of media. On November 13, 2012, the blog Evaganda wrote, quote, "The Mittani has killed Eve blogging. Why read through dozens of sites when you can just visit one? You get features, news, opinion, and the unquestionable loyalty of the largest single block of players.
God damn it,
in the
man.
game,
4 fails in a
daily
row.
forum support that
Come
rivals
on.
none other. I've been approached 3 times to write for the Mittani. The first was back before it launched, and the most recent was by the very same Mark Scaris that now poses the question of what to do with these
damn it,
blogging
man.
features. It is no mistake that other community-involved bloggers are also involved in that site. By the way, I turned all 3 of those requests down flat. Personally, I can't support the Mittani or the goons behind him. I don't link to the site here, nor will I ever do so. That is a role-playing choice primarily. But it is also because I knew full well what that things coming meant. And here we are. And it is only natural. Things change, remember? Eve is getting close to being a decade old. It is as predictable as the sun rising and setting that eventually something like that site would appear. End quote. But while both media outlets for game news and the alliances in nullsec were inexorably progressing toward a greater homogeneity, the players in wormhole space continued to establish themselves. Over time, they had discovered more and more about their chosen home, some facts being more esoteric than others, and this knowledge would turn this churning, chaotic hellscape into a verdant home replete with valuable minerals and friendly rivals. One of the most important habits adopted by early players was the mapping of wormhole space. Players from different corporations would be tasked with traveling through wormholes, taking note of what existed there, such as enemy bases or collectible resources, and sharing this information with the others, so that the immediate vicinity around their home system would be known, the connections spider-webbing out, with some branches terminating back into normal cave space. Due to the transient nature of the wormholes, these maps would have to be updated constantly, and they were closely guarded so as not to be used against their makers. However, players quickly discovered methods by which they could, to some extent, control this space. By sending heavy ships back and forth through wormholes in just the right patterns, wormholes could be coaxed into collapsing prematurely, while guaranteeing that no ship would be stranded on the far side, a practice known as rolling a hole. These tactics could be used both defensively and aggressively. A corporation with access to a static hole could purposefully collapse it again and again, searching for targets. A static hole that linked to other wormhole systems could serve as a way to search for new resource nodes from which to gather, or it could be a way to search for other corporations with whom to engage in affable combat for entertainment. But those outside of wormhole space came to know them for a different practice. If a wormhole corporation gained access to a nullsec static, then they could quietly use it to search for right targets. Once a proper target was spotted, a small raiding fleet would burst forth from the wormhole and begin raiding the surrounding space, destroying ships and looting until a response fleet could be organized. Given the relative power of nullsec corporations and the size and mass restrictions imposed by the wormholes, it was common for such response fleets to substantially outclass the raiding bands from the wormhole corporations. And so, upon sighting them, the raiders would retreat back through their wormhole, disappearing into the labyrinth. The relative secrecy and aggressive demeanor of the average wormholer placed them at odds with the nullsec empires, and over time, the two came to regard one another as bitter enemies, the nullsec alliances relying on stability and strength, and the wormholers embracing disorder and agility. Despite the equalizing forces of wormhole space, it still harbored its own elite, and they tended to occupy the C6 wormhole systems, the most dangerous and also the most valuable. The higher class systems tended to have unique stellar bodies, such as black holes and pulsars, which dramatically altered certain statistics about ships, making them even more difficult to assail, as their denizens would specialize their ships to utilize these peculiar features fully for defensive purposes, their ships funded by the valuable resources there and in the wormhole systems that tended to link to them. These larger corporations naturally became targets for others looking for a good fight. The most well-known example was the corporation Rooks and Kings, who delighted in discovering ways to push the game to its limits, and their French corporation, Guillotine Therapy, who primarily lived in wormhole space. Their YouTube series, named Clarion Call, attracted the attention even of those outside of the game, as their stories of frustrating the efforts of much larger corporations became legendary. In particular, they became known for a unique tactic, pipe bombing. By outfitting a small fleet of battleships with smart bombs and equipping defensive modules that allowed them to resist the particular kind of damage that the smart bombs produced, they could effectively destroy any intercepted enemy fleet while remaining mostly intact. This was made possible in part due to the rigid habits of fleet commanders in nullsec corporations, who were predictable enough for these strategies to continue to work for months. But even as great powers were establishing themselves, there was a new, unorthodox section of EVE Online growing faster than any other: the casinos. By sending ISK to trusted banker characters, players could exchange their in-game money for tokens to be used on gambling websites, much like chips at a real-life casino, and soon, players with vast stores of liquid assets and nothing else on which to spend them would gamble large amounts for entertainment. The money being funneled through these websites was massive and only growing day by day. But all of this was contingent upon Crowd Control Productions managing their game while simultaneously launching further games, something that would prove to be a titanic struggle. On May 22nd, 2013, Crowd Control Productions finally released their first-person shooter game, Dust 514. The game had been given limited beta releases throughout the previous year, but it was difficult to gauge what the final game would feel like after it was integrated into its parent game of EVE Online. But the nature of its existence made it difficult to penetrate. For casual players, the links between Dust and EVE weren't immediately apparent, and while the connection appeared to have worked well, the people who were downloading and playing Dust often did so not knowing that there was much, if any, connection to EVE. This could likely be attributed to the game's distribution method. As the game was made free to play by download on the PlayStation 3, many first-person shooter enthusiasts downloaded it to test, with little further understanding or research, expecting familiar fare. But the game that greeted them was significantly less accessible than a typical game in the genre. Chris Carter, writing for online gaming magazine Destructoid, described his initial experience. Quote, "For everyone else who is not already an EVE fan, you're going to see it as another first-person shooter. It will most likely not blow you away. In fact, as soon as I actually booted up my first skirmish, I was immediately underwhelmed. The environments, the guns, the visuals, everything but the stylized character models was extremely basic, to the point where at times it looks like a previous generation title. I experienced major frame rate issues, so much so that it affected my ability to see vehicles in the distance. At times, the game seemed to run well below 30 frames per second. I also experienced a decent amount of lag during my time with Dust, which is obviously a problem with an FPS, especially if you're fond of long-range combat." End quote. IGN's Vince Ingenito was similarly unimpressed. Quote, "The actual shooting isn't up to snuff. Similar games like Battlefield 3 succeeded by making it fun to fight both on foot and in vehicles, but Dust struggles to even make firing a gun feel right, much less vehicle combat. Now, I don't claim to be an expert marksman, but I had more trouble keeping my sights on target in Dust than in any FPS in recent memory. Part of this is due to the mushy aiming controls, which are too
On the
sluggish for
controller,
quick
yeah.
turns, yet too jumpy to track moving targets reliably.
Your
Sloppy,
skill has
protracted
increased.
firefights result, leaving my enemies and I to dance endlessly around each other, emptying our clips without scoring a kill. After playing with controls as tightly refined as those in Call
You
of
served me
Duty,
well, Zoo.
Battlefield,
I'm learning
and
more about
countless other
Beastmaster as I
shooters,
go.
Dusts feel
Your skill
terribly
has
empty.
Please
increased.
don't kill me.
In fact,
Yeah,
very
yeah.
little works or feels like it should in Dust 514. The maps are laid out well enough for combat, with some great verticality at times, but the limited detail and variety of the environments keep it from ever feeling like you're planet hopping for glory and profit." End quote. Even Ian Hertzberg from 10 Ton Hammer, who reviewed the game positively, said that, quote, "So far, I've felt like I was mostly making contact with Dust 514 players and found very little influence from EVE Online spilling over into the game. Which is a shame because the idea of the two games interacting seems cool in theory, but in practice, Dust 514 feels more like a standalone game." End quote. These limited connections between the games hadn't been solved half a year later, when GameSpot's Nick Cavazzoli wrote in December of that year that, quote, "Dust's link to EVE was supposed to provide the context for these endless war games, but the bond between the two games remains ill-defined. Corporations, the lifeblood of Eve, barely receive an introduction in Dust. End quote. The tepid reception of Dust 514 likely had a severe effect on the morale of employees at the company, who had watched 20% of their co-workers be laid off only a few years prior. Significant resources had been redirected from the highly anticipated World of Darkness MMO in order to complete this game, and with the severe impact that the Summer of Rage had inflicted upon the revenue of Crowd Control Productions, those who had been assigned to the project were nervous. This also boded poorly for other projects that the company had announced. In August of 2013, CCP had announced the development of a new space dogfighting game for VR, which they named Eve Valkyrie. Again hoping to act as an innovator in the gaming space, as the founding team had with Vermal and EVE Online, the project was originally a demo developed by employees, and now they had been flown to Britain in order to work on expanding it into a full game. But Valkyrie was slated for a 2014 release, only a year later. In comparison, the tenuous fate of World of Darkness...
This is it, I found the
nearly
niche.
A decade of work.
I'm learning to stay away from quests or anything that steers you somewhere. You should always just have your own vibe and wander aimlessly. At least for me. If something looks familiar, then something's wrong.
The team who had been anticipating this decision since the layoffs after the Summer of Rage in 2011. Allegedly, the World of Darkness team had been the most thoroughly impacted. An anonymous source stated that, quote, the 2011 layoffs incited a lot of anger. A lot. I heard it was worse in the ATL office, and most of the folks I know down there have never forgiven CCP's management. End quote. 2013 saw 15 more layoffs, leaving 56 team members going into the following year, a paltry number for the production of a new MMO. Those 56 remaining in April were either moved to other projects or laid off as well. Many had come
I want to
from
do
the
this on
original
retail.
White Wolf
I think I
team
do
that
want a
company
year
was bought.
sub, yeah.
Not all of the work from the game had been entirely lost. For example, much of the character creator had been adjusted and ported to EVE Online for players to update their avatars, a system that proved remarkably robust, but was only a fragment of the work that had been made for World of Darkness. With the middling release of Dust 514 and the complete collapse of World of Darkness, Crowd Control Productions was now reliant upon maintaining EVE Online, which they were struggling to manage after the release of Incarna. But those on the outside would see little of this struggle. Instead, they would bear witness to the largest conflict that any virtual world had ever seen.
Oh, God, Goblin. Or, I mean, Skelly.
By 2013, the pattern of warfare in Nullsec had been established as a constant state of conflict, punctuated by larger-scale wars between alliances and power blocks, and in October of that year, a new war roiled to life once again as Goonswarm's Cluster Coalition, or CFC as it was known, was expanding. Andrew Groen writes, quote, the Cluster Empire now mirrored eerily the dominion of the former Band of Brothers at its peak, save for the fact it was a bit larger and more stable.
Nice.
For only the third time in New Eden's history, half of the Nullsec territories were controlled by a single organization of players united under a single ruler. As October 2013 came to a close, it was already becoming clear that a new block-level war would soon begin. By now, few were even surprised, as it was clear that in some respects, Eve was in the midst of a forever war. The individuals that made up these alliances could not be destroyed, and neither could their very real animosity for one another, which was compounding through the years. End quote. This animosity exploded in 2013 into what came to be known as the Halloween War. As the Russian coalition attempted to capture space in a border conflict, their allies in the CFC sent minor support, which quickly expanded into their entire supercapital fleet. Uniting to fight them, a massive group of nullsec players gathered under the name N3PL and prepared for war. For 3 months, the war raged until January 27, 2014, when an opportunity arose for the CFC. Due to a bug in the game's user interface, a bug in the servers, or a clerical error on the part of a player in N3PL, the payment required to maintain the sovereignty in the crucial staging system of BTAC R5RB failed, leaving an 8-hour window for them to assail the system before the Sino-jammers became active again, and no further capital ships could be brought by the attackers. At first, there was confusion, but even if it was a trap, the leaders of the CFC accepted it for what it was, an opportunity to strike at their enemies, the likes of which they were unlikely to see again for the rest of the war. The call was made, and despite being off hours for the CFC, fleets were formed. Few had any conception of what was about to happen. Writing for Crossing Zebras, player Sindel Hellion wrote, quote, "The reports that were coming in were saying that this was a supercap fight. There was a lot of talk that it would not last that long. We just needed to drop TCUs again and try to regain control of the station. No one, not me, not anybody, could have known what the next 20-odd hours held." End quote. Together, the Cluster Coalition and the Russian Alliance gathered their fleets and jumped into
Thanks
the
for that.
beachhead system of BTAC R5RB. On Twitter, Pro-God Legend, then leader of founding N3 member Noli Secunda, wrote about what was happening from Denver Airport as the two fleets danced around one another non-committable. Quote, "About 500 CFC players in system, all Dominic's battleships. N3PL jumped in slow caps and super capitals off-grid. Dominic's is warped to caps, then changed mind and failed. And now it's a face-off, waiting for the fight to start. All fleets are in system, but not on grid with each other." End quote. The commanders of both fleets knew the location of the other in the system, but nobody fighting could see anything except for their allies, waiting tensely with the bright nebulas surrounding them. The appearances of the fleets were dominated by the massive Avatar-class Titans, whose silhouettes were immediately recognizable and were the most common of any of the Titans. The onus was on the attackers, and so, together, the CFC fleet warped to engage with the forces of N3PL. Given the amount of resources being invested in this battle, it was clear that if the goons could win this fight, then there would be nothing standing between them and total control of Nullsec. But even before the first shots were fired, there was a complication. In 2011, a mechanic to compensate for lag in heavily populated battles had been introduced, called time dilation. When a server was faced with a load too heavy for it to handle, rather than simply allowing lag to impact gameplay, time in the region would be slowed to allow the server to process all of the data moving through it. But since time was only slowed in the immediate vicinity of the battle, reinforcements could arrive far faster relative to the damage being dealt. And so, given that the passage of time in BTAC R5RB had been slowed to 10% of real time, the slowest possible, the battle rapidly grew. And given the strategic importance of the system, neither side was willing to concede. Images and video quickly made their way online, even as the battle was raging, showing a kaleidoscope of colors and shapes dominated by the dark shadows of the Avatar and Erebus-class Titans against a backdrop of blue interdiction bubbles, which locked every ship inside of them into combat. The rate of escalation only quickened as time passed and players in the Americas were able to log into the game and join the battle, which was still raging hours later. By this point, thousands of players had already participated. Compared to their enemies, the Goons easily had more players in the Americas, and soon they outnumbered their opponents by a significant margin. After brawling for 12 hours, the final result was clear. The CFC would be the victors in this massive battle, which reportedly had over 7,500 participants at various points, with over 2,600 in the system concurrently at its peak. This latter number had only been eclipsed by another battle involving the CFC, in which they had smothered the Reddit-based Test Alliance in a battle involving 4,070 concurrently, but the result of that battle was a foregone conclusion, fought more for fun than any other reason. Comparatively, the battle for BTAC R5RB was far more spontaneous, strategically vital, and uncertain. The question now was only how much N3PL could salvage. This number would prove far smaller than they hoped. Of the 72 Titans that they fielded, only 13 survived. Comparatively, the losses of the CFC were minuscule. Not only had the reserves of N3PL been broken, but so had their spirit during the 21-hour-long engagement. But from the outside, the conclusion looked significantly different. The introduction of Plex had given an approximate real-world exchange rate between in-game currency and real-world fiat currency, and when the damage was tallied and converted, the cost of the entire battle exceeded $300,000 US. This number was immediately attractive to news outlets, who printed simplified versions of the story to their bemused readers while sheepishly referring to the Cluster Coalition only by their acronym. Now, the Goons were left with the largest empire in the game and the media attention to make them the unequivocal masters of EVE Online, and they would soon come to embody that status in a familiar way. But while the Goons were ascendant, the company that made the game they had mastered was struggling with their other game, and despite how desperately they wanted success, it seemed continuously to elude them.
Nice, he full-blown killed it. Nice, I full-blown healed. That works for me. You full-blown kill this one too? Let's both kill this one.
Since its launch in 2012, Dust 514 had been struggling. While the game allegedly had players measured in the hundreds of thousands and its financial success isn't publicly known, it's almost certain that the company was dubious of the game's reception shortly.
I actually really like the
launch.
throwing knives.
Many who had been excited for Dust were concerned from the beginning. The fact that it was a PlayStation 3 exclusive game
Your skill has increased.
hampered its growth, as most who were aware of EVE Online played games on their PC rather than a console. But perhaps more importantly, the PlayStation 3 was already nearing the end of its life cycle as Dust was being launched. Typically, game consoles have a limited lifespan due to the company's desire to create new consoles with updated hardware, and the first iteration of the PlayStation 3 had been released in 2006. This meant that, by the time Dust was released, the console was already 6 years old, and many were anticipating the release of a successor console in the near future. These expectations proved correct, as in February of 2013, less than a year after the release of Dust, Sony announced that the PlayStation 4 would be sold during the holiday season of that year. Frequently, console gamers will leave behind old consoles in favor of new ones quickly, and this meant that the future of Dust was in jeopardy. The game had originally been announced with a 5-year development plan, and CCP's Vice President of Business Development, Thor Gunnarsson, confidently repeated these claims to gaming publication Destructoid. Quote, "We know that our fan base, Dust-curious players, are buying the PlayStation 3 to get into our game. What we hear anecdotally is that PS3 sales are increasing. Sony have done a phenomenal job of managing console transitions like they did with the PlayStation 2's cost and size reductions. We can make the logical assumption that something similar will happen as the PlayStation 4 comes to market. If you look at the large third-party publishers, you'll see that Sony is not falling away from the PlayStation 3. End quote. The author of the article, Joseph Larray, added that, quote, still, CCP will eventually need to develop a PlayStation 4 version of Dust 514, link it to the PS3 version, and then tie both of them to Tranquility, the London-based server that governs everything that happens in the EVE universe. And they'll do it, ideally, with as little downtime as possible. End quote. This would require even more development time and effort, something that CCP were already struggling to manage after the failure of Incarna and the death of World of Darkness. The game itself was rife with issues to which players consistently referred as systemic and fundamental. For example, players could gain the EVE integration by joining the opposite side and manipulating whether they won or lost, depending on what was more beneficial at the time, in order to acquire territory. Xander Fena, writing for Crossing Zebras in June of 2013, discussed his problems further in his article, The Tragedy of Dust 514, in which he states, quote, Dust had definitely caught my attention, and before I knew it, I was hooked in the hype. 4 years later, I wish they had just scrapped the entire project altogether. Throughout this article, Xander discussed many of the fundamental issues, including one of its main selling points, its connection to EVE Online. Quote, the key feature at the release of Dust was planetary conquest. 1 month later, several of the major groups involved with it have announced they've pulled out or will not defend the districts they've taken. Planetary conquest, in a nutshell, took the worst aspect of EVE, structure grinding, and made it their key feature. The other key feature that was sold directly to the EVE Online audience was the ability for EVE ships to orbital bombard planets. When the feature was first revealed at FanFest 2012, there was a lot of excitement. It looked and felt cool. A year later, the orbital bombardment mechanic has been watered down. There are no launch codes, and you're limited to both the class of ship and waiting for ground teams to accumulate a certain amount of war points before you can launch a strike. The novelty wore off very quickly, and the interest EVE side plummeted. There have been a lot of complaints within the Dust community that the links to EVE need to be drastically expanded in order to attract more players. I disagree wholeheartedly. The game itself will never sustain a community if there aren't drastic improvements to even the most basic gameplay. The links will be meaningless if the game itself is terrible, and developing it on both games will be entirely wasted if either game is suffering. EVE is in a pretty healthy state. Dust is on life support. Forcing interactions between the two when one game is in trouble is a disservice to the other. End quote. Despite the company's confident public rhetoric, it appeared less confident when, a year later in May of 2014 at EVE FanFest, CCP announced that they had begun development on a new first-person shooter game with the working title of Project Legion. This game would be developed for the PC, in contrast to Dust's PlayStation 3 exclusivity.
Your skill has increased.
The opening of an article by Andy Kelly for PC Gamer made clear the broad reaction to the announcement, notably referring to Dust 514 in the past tense, despite the fact that the servers were still online and, as far as the gaming public knew,